At 95, Clint Eastwood has become something more than a Hollywood legend. He's a man who has outlived nearly every myth built around him. For decades, he was the face of American masculinity, the silent gunslinger, the stoic anti-hero, the man who never blinked. But behind the sharp eyes and quiet confidence was a life filled with chaos, heartbreak, and longing. Now, as he looks back on nearly a century of fame, he admits there were 6 women he could never truly forget. 6 stories that left scars deeper than any bullet wound. Sondra Locke, the woman who changed everything. If there was ever one woman Clint Eastwood could never erase from his mind, it was Sondra Locke. She wasn't just another fleeting Hollywood romance. She was the turning point in his life, the one that blurred the lines between love, obsession, and control. Their story began in 1972 when Locke auditioned for Breezy, a film Clint was directing. She didn't get the role. He thought she was too mature for the character. But something passed between them, a spark that lingered quietly for years. In 1975, Clint cast her in the outlaw Josie Wales, and by the time the cameras rolled, that spark had ignited into something far deeper. What began as on-screen chemistry soon became one of the most volatile relationships Hollywood had ever seen. Locke wasn't just Clint's co-star. She became his muse, his creative partner, and his emotional mirror. They made 6 films together, including The Gauntlet, Every Which Way But Loose, and Sudden Impact. To the public, they were the perfect power couple, 2 artists bound by passion and ambition. Behind closed doors, however, their connection was far more complicated. Clint told her that she was the only woman who had ever made him faithful, that he finally understood what love meant. Locke, who had been married since 1967 to her gay best friend Gordon Anderson in what she later described as a marriage of convenience, believed Clint's promises. She took a pay cut to star alongside him, thinking it was a small sacrifice for love and partnership. They built a life together in homes from Sherman Oaks to Carmel, and Locke threw herself into Clint's world, his projects, his rhythms, his fame. But over time, she began to feel suffocated. She wanted her own identity, her own career. She wanted to direct. Clint supported her on paper, but, according to her later accounts, quietly undermined her behind the scenes. When she directed Rat Boy in 1986, the project faced resistance from the studio. When she tried again with Impulse in 1990, she found herself creatively isolated. She began to see the subtle ways her independence threatened him. Their romance, once filled with passion, turned cold and controlling. Locke later said that Clint persuaded her to have 2 abortions and a tubal ligation because he didn't want more children, decisions that haunted her for years. By 1989, the relationship collapsed completely. One night, while working on Impulse, Locke returned home to find the locks changed, her clothes packed away, and a letter from Clint's lawyers addressed to Mrs. Gordon Anderson. It was a cruel, deliberate humiliation. She fainted on the spot. The fallout was explosive. Locke filed a palimony lawsuit accusing Clint of emotional cruelty, deceit, and destroying her career. A year later, they settled. Clint arranged a $1.5 million Warner Brothers development deal for her, along with financial support. But Locke later claimed it was all a setup, that Clint used his influence to make sure none of her projects ever got approved. She felt silenced, blacklisted, and broken. In 1995, she sued him again, this time for fraud and breach of contract. They settled privately the following year, but the emotional damage was irreversible. As her career faded, her health declined. In the late 1990s, Locke was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a double mastectomy. Later, cancer spread to her bones. She said that the years of manipulation and stress had left her body and spirit exhausted. Clint, despite everything they had shared, never reached out. When Locke died in 2018 at age 74, she left her entire $20 million estate to Gordon Anderson, the the one person who had stood by her through every storm. For Clint Eastwood, her death marked the end of an era he rarely speaks about. But those who knew him say that Sondra Locke remained an unhealed wound in his life, a love that began with fire and ended in ashes. She was the woman who knew both the best and worst parts of him, the one who changed him forever, and the one whose absence still echoed long after she was gone. Maggie Johnson, the first love and the foundation. Long before Clint Eastwood became a Hollywood icon, before the Oscars, before the scandals, before the fame, there was Maggie Johnson. It was 1953, a time of innocence and optimism in post-war America. Clint had just been discharged from the U.S. Army, a tall, ambitious 23-year-old with no clear path ahead. Maggie was a bright and refined student at the University of California, Berkeley, known for her poise and intelligence. They met on a blind date in San Francisco, arranged by a mutual friend. Clint was struck by her grace, she by his quiet confidence. Within months, they married. She was 22, he was 23, and both were too young to understand that their vows would anchor the most formative years of his life. Their marriage began with promise, but restlessness was already in Clint's nature. He had charm, opportunity, and an insatiable curiosity that made fidelity difficult. What Maggie didn't know was that, around the time of their wedding, Clint had already fathered a child with another woman in Seattle, a daughter named Lori, who would later be adopted and reappear in his life decades later. That hidden chapter would remain one of Hollywood's most astonishing secrets. In the early years, Maggie's calmness balanced Clint's unpredictability. When his acting career stumbled, she was the quiet supporter behind the scenes, encouraging him through rejection after rejection. She believed in his potential when few others did. Then came Rawhide in 1959, the Western TV series that transformed Clint into a household name. With fame came fortune, but also temptation. The long months on set, surrounded by adoring fans and co-stars, chipped away at their bond. Maggie endured the gossip, the whispers, and the late nights alone, all while maintaining her composure. She represented dignity in an era when Hollywood wives were expected to stay silent. By the mid-1960s, Clint's name was global. The Man with No Name trilogy, A Fistful of Dollars, for a few dollars more, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, made him a superstar. But success only widened the emotional distance between them. Maggie tried to build a family life, and in 1968, she gave birth to their son, Kyle, followed by daughter Allison in 1972. Clint adored his children, but his heart was never truly home. His career consumed him, and his wandering eye became impossible to ignore. When Clint met actress Sondra Locke in the mid-1970s, the fragile balance collapsed. Locke was fiery and independent, everything Maggie was not, and their affair became an open secret. For years, Maggie endured in silence, refusing to humiliate her husband publicly. But by 1979, the marriage was beyond repair. She moved out, taking the children to Carmel by the Sea, the peaceful coastal town that Clint would later make famous as its mayor. Their divorce was finalized in 1984 after 5 years of separation, with Maggie reportedly receiving a $25 million settlement, an enormous sum at the time, but one she never flaunted. Despite the heartbreak, Maggie Johnson never spoke ill of Clint Eastwood. She avoided tabloids, never published a tell-all book, and never sought revenge. Instead, she built her own quiet life, raising Kyle and Allison with grace. In later interviews, Clint admitted that Maggie had been the foundation of everything. She stood by him when he was broke and unknown, when his career teetered on failure, when the world had yet to call him a legend. Maggie's strength became a mirror for Clint's flaws, her loyalty highlighting his restlessness, her silence exposing his guilt. Though they divorced, Their connection never truly vanished. Clint continued to support their children, and family gatherings often brought them together again, this time without bitterness. She remained, in his mind, the symbol of what stability once looked like. The calm before decades of emotional storms. Every love that came after her was measured against Maggie Johnson. She was not the most famous woman in his life, nor the most dramatic, but she was the one who grounded him when nothing else could. Even now, in his old age, when Clint speaks of her, it's with quiet respect, as if he knows that without Maggie, there would have been no legend called Clint Eastwood. Roxanne Tunis and Jocelyn Reeves, the hidden chapters. If Maggie represented the beginning of Clint's family life, Roxanne Tunis represented its secret underbelly. They met in 1959 on the set of Rawhide, when Clint was a rising television star and Roxanne was a married stuntwoman. Their affair lasted nearly 14 years, an open secret among those who worked with them. In 1964, Roxanne gave birth to a daughter, Kimber. The news was kept hidden from the public for decades, and Clint himself didn't learn of the birth until a year later. Kimber grew up largely outside of Clint's life, though he quietly supported her. Roxanne lived privately, far from Hollywood's chaos. When she passed away in June 2023 after a brief illness, their daughter Kimber shared that Clint had been deeply affected. For all their secrecy, the bond never truly disappeared. 2 decades later, history repeated itself. In the 1980s, Clint met Jocelyn Reeves, a flight attendant from Hawaii. Their relationship was discreet, almost invisible to the press, but its consequences were enormous. Jocelyn gave birth to 2 children, Scott Eastwood in 1986 and Catherine in 1988. Scott would grow up to become a Hollywood actor, determined to succeed on his own merit rather than his father's fame. Clint acknowledged both children later in life, describing them as his proudest gifts. Roxanne and Jocelyn were women who lived in the shadows of Clint's fame. They never gave interviews, never sold their stories, never asked for recognition. But through them came some of the most enduring parts of his legacy, his children. Even Clint, with all his bravado, would later admit that his quietest loves were the ones who changed him the most. Frances Fisher. The Brief Peace. By the late 1980s, Clint's life was a web of overlapping relationships. Then came Frances Fisher. They met on the set of Pink Cadillac in 1988. Frances later described the meeting as love at first sight. Unlike his past affairs, theirs was open and affectionate. They walked red carpets together, appeared in interviews, and seemed genuinely in sync. In 1993, Frances gave birth to their daughter, Francesca. For a brief moment, Clint seemed to have found balance. He was calmer, more present, and more committed than ever before. Frances once said, "He was happy being a father again, and I was happy watching him smile." But as always, peace never lasted long. By 1995, cracks began to show. Frances discovered Clint still had lingering connections with Jocelyn Reeves and was seen by paparazzi kissing another woman. Betrayed and heartbroken, Frances ended the relationship. Yet unlike others before her, she didn't let the breakup turn bitter. They remained friends, co-parenting Francesca without scandal or resentment. In later years, Frances spoke of Clint with respect. She called him a complex man, full of contradictions, but also credited him with helping her grow as an artist and person. Their time together was short, but it marked one of the few relationships in Clint's life that ended with forgiveness instead of fury. Dina Ruiz, the second wife and the last vow. Dina Ruiz entered Clint's life in 1992 when she interviewed him for KSBW-TV. She was a local news anchor, young, poised, and far removed from Hollywood glamour. Their chemistry was instant but unexpected. By 1995, they were inseparable, and in March 1996, Clint surprised her with a spontaneous wedding at the home of his friend, casino mogul Steve Wynn, in Las Vegas. Later that same year, Dina gave birth to their daughter, Morgan. For nearly 2 decades, they lived what seemed like a peaceful life in Carmel. Dina often spoke of Clint's humility, calling him the most gentle soul. In interviews, she described him as a man who preferred rescuing bugs over killing them, earning him her nickname Saint Francis of Assisi. But the serenity didn't last. In 2012, Dina launched the reality show Mrs. Eastwood and Company, featuring her and their daughter, Morgan. Clint hated it. He felt it violated his lifelong commitment to privacy. Tensions rose quickly, and by 2013, the marriage was collapsing. In a strange twist, Dina grew close to basketball coach Scott Fisher, while Clint began dating Fisher's ex-wife, Erica. The tabloids had a field day. By 2014, the divorce was finalized. Yet even then, Dina refused to attack him publicly. On Twitter, she called Clint a wonderful, good-natured, brilliant man. 2 years later, she remarried Scott Fisher. Still, she said that Clint had changed her life for the better, that despite everything, she never regretted loving him. Christina Sandera, the final companion. By the time Clint Eastwood met Christina Sandera, he was in his mid-80s, long past the years of scandal and headlines. Christina worked as a hostess at his Mission Ranch Hotel in Carmel, the property he had lovingly restored. Their relationship began quietly, built on shared routines rather than fame. For Clint, Christina represented something different. She wasn't an actress, not a social climber, not part of the Hollywood machine. She cooked for him, kept him company, and made him laugh. When she appeared on his arm at the 2015 Academy Awards, the world finally learned her name. Unlike his past lovers, Christina blended effortlessly with his family. In 2018, she attended the Mule premiere alongside Clint's children and even his first wife, Maggie Johnson. It was a rare, peaceful moment that spoke volumes about how far he'd come. As the years passed, Christina became his anchor. She stood by him through his late projects, Sully, Richard Jewell, and Cry Macho. She represented calm after a lifetime of storms. When she passed away in July 2024 at age 61, Clint was devastated. Friends said he withdrew for weeks, mourning quietly in Carmel. To those who knew him, she was proof that even a man who built his image on toughness could still long for tenderness. For Clint Eastwood, love was never simple. It was raw, messy, and unforgettable. Maggie Johnson gave him foundation. Sondra Locke brought fire. Francis Fisher offered balance. Dina Ruiz gave stability. Jocelyn Reeves and Roxanne Tunis brought him family. And Christina Sandera gave him peace. At 95, he's outlived the fame, the rumors, and the heartbreak, but not the memories. Which of these women do you think had the biggest impact on Clint Eastwood's life? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.